Welcome back once again, everybody, to episode 13 of the iProgress podcast. I'm your host, Dean, and as always, I'm joined by Craig. And today we're looking at setting SMART goals. Now, SMART goals are a particular subset of goals which really help you, especially in kind of coaching environments, to dig in deep in terms of what you want to achieve, how you want to achieve it, and hopefully facilitate that achievement for you. So when we look at breaking down what SMART goals are, S means specific. So these goals are very clear, specific goals, and easy to achieve. M stands for measurable. So when goals are measurable, this tells you that the goal or action can actually be completed and when it will be completed. Actionable. So for these goals to be successful, you need to be able to have full autonomy and action control over those goals. So you're not letting those goals down to other people's achievements. Or these goals need to be realistic. They need to be achievable by you with the resources that you have at your disposal. And also T, this stands for time bound. So real effective goals need to be achieved within a particular space and time, because if they can't, you'll let these goals drag on forever, and ultimately you'll never know when they're completed, and you won't get that sense of satisfaction when you do eventually bring them to a close. So Craig, why are SMART goals so important for students, academics, people of the general population to be using?
I think it's important because if you set really broad goals, then how do you know that you've actually achieved something? So it might be, for example, you've got a goal of, I want to write a paper.
Mm-hmm.
That's the goal. It's really broad. You don't know how you're going to break that down into different sections. When are you going to have that paper written by? Have you got collaborators? Do you have control over their diaries? If you can start to break those things down and make those SMART goals in relation to maybe each part of that paper, you can then start to plan a little bit better. We talk a lot about time block planning and how you can put stuff in your diary about, okay, at this point, I'm going to have time to do this particular task. If you've got SMART goals, then you can put those specific goals into those time blocks rather than just having a general paper writing task.
Yeah, so maybe we can use that action as writing a paper as the example throughout the rest of this podcast, because I think that's going to be something that really hits home for all of our readership and viewership if you're watching on YouTube as well. I think that oftentimes when we do sit down to write, these things can get delayed. Lots of other things happen, and we can kind of acknowledge that throughout whilst we're talking about these SMART goals. But for me, I think that when I'm coaching people and trying to get them to really reflect on why they beat themselves up almost sometimes, it's because they are setting themselves tasks which might be far outreaching and possibly not achievable for them. So from the outset, if you're setting yourself a task to do something and you don't really have a specific time scale for it, you're almost setting your expectations a little bit too high. So for example, running with the theme of writing a paper, if you say from the outset, I'm going to have this paper, or at least the introduction of it, written by the end of the day, that might sound, reasonable the first time you say it. But when you start to break it down and say, okay, so actually I've not got the entire day, I've got maybe 6 hours, and I haven't started looking at the literature in that area, and I'm not giving myself enough time to redraft things. Just by sitting down and reflecting just for 10, 15, 30 seconds, instantaneously you can see that from the outset that goal's not going to be achieved. And so when you get to the end of the day, or when you get to the end of the week, you look back and say, well, actually I've not achieved anything that I set myself out for. And that will put you in a really negative frame of mind. You might start to have that self-doubt in terms of, well, actually, can I write this paper, or am I good enough to write this paper? And that kind of gets us into a whole other, avenue of adversary. But if you were to go back to the start, use this SMART goal dynamic as a way of framing those goals from the off, suddenly you're giving yourself smaller amounts of work to do, smaller chunks of work, if we're using that terminology, and you're having a lot more highs than you would previously.
Yeah, I think, I don't mean it to sound kind of disparaging, but I think you're giving people a little bit too much credit in terms of I don't think people sit down and say, I'm going to write my introduction by the end of today. I think people sit down typically and they'll say, I'm going to work on my paper today.
Yeah.
So it's even less specific than that. It's more vague than that. I think if you have that view of, I'm going to sit down and work on my paper today, then you're just setting yourself up to fail. You're setting yourself up to have that loss of motivation at the end of the day. If you're sitting down to work on your paper, invariably what you'll do is you'll probably write about 500 words, 500, 600 words max on that paper. All that means is that you've not even written a full part of the paper, which isn't an issue. Like, that's a totally normal thing to have done in a day. But if you sat down with the aim of writing or working on your paper, and at the end of the day, you've still got, if we split it up into kind of halves of parts of a paper, you've still got 5/6 of a paper to write, then you feel as though you haven't achieved anything.
Sure.
So I think having these kind of really specific goals at the start of the day, if you've got a day's worth of work ahead of you, making sure that it's measurable, that you've got a target maybe of, so we've written in the past about 500 words a day. If you've got that target in your head, then once you hit that target, you've met your goal, and anything else is a bonus.
Agreed.
Rather than it being, I've only written 600 words. So yeah, I think the vagueness of most people's goals is a real issue in terms of motivation.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. So if we do kind of map that onto this writing a paper, and what we can do, we can talk our listeners through exactly how they could apply this to this particular topic. So you very much hit the nail on the head there, where you say that actually we're perhaps sitting down, not setting ourselves targets, and if we do, we're so vague and broad with it. That very much maps directly onto the specific element of SMART goals. So for us, we want to be able to articulate what we want to do and what we want to achieve at the end of the goal. Okay, so remember that we're not setting ourselves any time boundaries just yet. That's going to come in later. And it's also important to remember that when we do set these goals, this is our first draft. So we might have to go back and redraft our goals before we've settled on something that can bring that positivity to us. So in terms of being very specific, we want to write the introduction for our paper or our project. Okay, that is as clear and as concise as you can possibly be. I want to sit down and write my introduction for this paper or project. And what you'll find is that if you do have these goals which are written too lengthy, actually that can convolute the discussion. It can make it really complex and difficult to not only articulate but also to end up actioning, and that's another kind of avenue where you can find yourself getting lost. The second accompanying element to setting the goal around this particular writing project would be that measurability. Okay, so I'm going to write the introduction for my paper or my project, but we want to start adding those specifics to it, and that's where this measurability comes in. So how do I know that I finished this? Well, I'm going to have a full draft. That draft is going to be around 2,000 words in length once it's complete, and we can either grab that information from any assignments that we're given, or we can grab it from, if we're working towards a paper that we're publishing, oftentimes there might be guidelines in and around these journal articles about how long each section should be, or we can use existing journals that have been submitted or articles submitted within those journals to kind of retrospectively identify that information. So around about 2,000 words once complete for our introduction. And that's something which is very measurable. We might then come at a junction by saying, okay, so actually, do I want to go back and add more specifics? So for example, am I just talking about the first draft, or am I talking about a completed paper? And that's going to be very specific depending on, you know, your individual situation. If you are wanting a complete, you know, introduction ready, you might there want to say that it's a redrafted introduction that is around about 2,000 words in length, because that also adds that element of specificity, going back to the first S within the SMART goals, that tells you that not only am I needing to, first of all, draft this, but I need to go over it and edit and fine tune those specific elements. So, Craig, do you want to talk us up through actionable and realistic elements of these goals as well?
Yeah, so the A stands for actionable, and this is where you have kind of full control, I guess. Are you actually able to complete this task in the way that you would like to? So it might be that you have, I don't know, certain things that go on in your life. You might have childcare responsibilities where on a certain day you're not able to work or something like that. So you're kind of factoring that in to your planning of the completion of this goal. So you're thinking about, what are my limitations? What are my abilities? And is this a realistic kind of goal for me to consider, which kind of ties in to the next part of the SMART goals, which is realistic. So again, is this achievable within the boundaries of my abilities? Do I have the capabilities to do it? Is this something that I can achieve? So then you're putting a plan into place so that you can step by step start to work on achieving this plan. So we've spoken already about the 500 words a day idea. It's very realistic for you to do that rather than to sit down and say, I'm going to write my introduction. So you're thinking about, how are you actually going to go about doing this? We've also spoken about the read, write, cite method, which is where you read papers to start with, don't write anything. Then you write down what it is that you want the reader to take from your work, and then afterwards you go back and enter your citations. These are methods to achieve a writing goal that you can use to achieve the target that you've already set. So they're kind of ways of making your work actionable and realistic at the same time.
Yeah, I very much think that those two goals go together. It's worth noting that for academics in the large part, I think that I would say that the majority, of their writing goals are very they're going to be very actionable. They're going to be very achievable by themselves. You do need to be mindful, especially like what Craig was saying about those kind of things that are going on in your life as well, such as childcare responsibilities, making sure you're dedicating that time, but also perhaps looking forward a little bit and saying, well, what role do any of my collaborators have? Or if I'm a student in a group setting, I'm probably losing that actionable elements, because I need to rely on other people. So that's where you might need to be breaking those goals down a little bit more to say, okay, so for my element, this is my specific SMART goal for my portion of this work, but I'm also having a SMART goal for a much broader piece of the work as a whole, but I need to be mindful that not all of those components are fully in my control. And I think it's having that awareness which really does help, not only to kind of mitigate these potential breakdown of group dynamics, but also to make sure that you're fully on top of the work that you can control, and you're not beating yourself up or feeling too down about the broader concept of elements that you can't control. It's just yet another reminder that people work in different ways, and that when we do come together as a group, which has applicability for your future career when you are going to be working as a group a lot of time, that you do need to have that reliance on other people that might not have that same mantra and or work ethic as yourself. So to round off this kind of example of a SMART goal, we also need to make sure that those goals are time bound. Now, as academics, when we're setting assignments for students, we are giving you a deadline. We're giving a deadline which we believe that piece of work, or we know that piece of work is achievable within this particular time frame. So from a student perspective, that's something that should already be built into your SMART goals. It should be something that you are conscious of. Make sure you always know when your deadlines are. That's kind of a key thing to take forward. But I kind of guess as an academic, that's where, because we have lots of competing interests, we've got lots of stuff going on throughout the week. And in fact, in next week's podcast, we are going to be talking about a week in the life of an academic. So make sure to subscribe to the channel for that and catch that video or podcast. But because of that, it means that we're having so much of our work life disrupted. There might be a student issue that just comes up that we need to delay our work for, or there might be something that comes in that we need to triage of slightly more importance than our writing, which is this, this kind of target that's always in the back of our minds. And so making sure that we set that time frame as specifically as possible, but with maybe a week or two or maybe a month or two buffer if it's a specifically long project, to make sure that we can still achieve it. So if we put in the minimum amount of time that it will take for this goal to be achieved, then any sort of disruption that happens between now and then fully throws out the deadline of the goal, makes it unachievable straight from the off. And that might be the afternoon that you actually set the goal. So just be mindful about including those buffers as well. Along that way, you might also, and this is very kind of specifically related to maybe externally funded projects if you're an academic, or long-term projects, you might also be wanting to break those SMART goals down into shorter, more manageable goals, just to make sure you're keeping on track. And it's probably something to look for another video, but we work a lot in terms of milestones. So by this date, we want to have this amount of work achieved. By this date, we want to have this amount of work achieved. We might want this particular outcome. It's a very good process for PhD students, which is why we want to do a video on it. But what those milestones allow you to do, and it goes back to what we was talking about right at the start of setting these SMART goals, is if you're suddenly finding that the work might be a lot more than you first envisaged, or there might be life circumstances happening, or there might be work that's coming in that you need to triage, then we can go back and then we can reassess those goals before we fail at them, because that is where all this kind of negativity and hardship comes from. The fact that we are missing our deadlines, the fact that we are not in our minds achieving our goals. But I genuinely believe that a lot of that comes from the fact that we're setting goals which we're almost setting ourselves up to fail right from the off.
Yeah, I think the idea of so I think it's called multi-scale planning, in terms of setting smaller goals within a broader goal. Like you say, Dean, what we try and do is we'll say, okay, we want to have a paper written by, I don't know, the end of this year, something like that. We'll then set targets of, okay, we need to get the ethics submitted by this date so that we can collect data in this window, so we can analyze the data here, so we can write the paper here. So they're kind of smaller goals within the larger goal, but each of those smaller goals within them have smaller SMART related goals. So it might be that we want to have a rationale for our introduction written by a certain date, which is, I don't know, say if we're submitting the paper in December, I don't know, before we start collecting data, so maybe May, we want to we want to have a rationale written by that point, because we know that we need to have that, we should have that before we start collecting our data, because at that point we should know what our hypotheses are. So yeah, thinking about that multi-scale element of goal planning is really important, and making sure that you're breaking things down in a way that, again, is realistic, that you're going to be able to hit those targets. Because again, it just ties back into motivation all the time. If I say to someone that I'm going to write a paper by the end of December, and I'm telling them that at the start of February, in my mind, I've got 10, 11 months to do that paper. Whereas actually what I've got is maybe 6 weeks to do the ethics form. And then I've got another 4 weeks to write the introduction. And then I've got maybe 2 months of data collection. It's not quite as simple as just saying, okay, well, that's in the future that I can think about at some other point. You need to have those multi-scale planning. And I think Cal Newport talks about this as well. I realise we talk about him a lot. Maybe we should try and get him to sponsor the podcast, doesn't it? Because he's getting so much advertising on these episodes. But he talks about it a lot in terms of multi-scale planning, yearly, weekly, by semester, by day, making sure that you've got these really specific goals that are SMART related, at multiple different aspects and multiple different scales of your working life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. So to summarize, we're looking at SMART goals. These goals need to be specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time bound. If you've got to the end of this video or the end of the podcast, let us know in the comments down below what goals you're setting for the upcoming year. It's going to be really huge year for us all. I think we're going to try and do our best to get as much writing done as possible, get as many publications as possible. If you're a student, try and survive if possible to get to the end of your degrees, and we wish you the best of luck with those. Hopefully these really actionable SMART goals can help you succeed no matter what walk of life you're trying to accomplish your writing in. So thank you very much as always. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure to subscribe, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really does help us out a lot. And until next time, we will see you in the next podcast.